Welcome to Constitutional Landmarks. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheimer. I'm an advocate at the Johannesburg Bar, and I've appeared frequently at the Constitutional Court. In the last two episodes of this series, you've heard different views on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the first episode, you heard from Justice Albie Sachs and from Gilbert Marcus. In the second, from Salim Nakjavani and his experience at the Cambodia Tribunal prosecuting the Khmer Rouge. In this episode, I will start with former President FW De Klerk's testimony at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. During this episode, I'll be speaking to Dave Steward, who was the government spokesperson for FW De Klerk during the time of his reign.
Apartheid was wrong. I apologize in my capacity as leader of the National Party to the millions of South Africans who suffered the wrenching disruption of forced removals in respect of their homes, businesses and land, who over the years suffered the shame of being arrested for past law offences, who over the decades and indeed centuries suffered the indignities and humiliation of racial discrimination, who for a long time were prevented from exercising their full democratic rights in the land of their birth, who were unable to achieve their full potential because of job reservation, and who in any other way suffered as a result of discriminatory legislation and policy. Let me state clearly that the National Party and I accept full responsibility for all our policies, decisions and action.
I was a diplomat. I spent most of my career in the Department of Foreign Affairs, ending up as a South African ambassador to the United Nations at the beginning of the 1980s. I was then put in charge of our communication agency, the South African Communication Service. And from there, I was transferred to FW De Klerk's office, where I was first government spokesperson and then the Director General in his office during the very exciting and sometimes traumatic transition process. And after that, FW De Klerk and I founded the FW De Klerk Foundation in 1999, and our main business is supporting the Constitution that he helped to negotiate.
Can you tell us a bit about that constitutional negotiation process?
Well, of course, it's one of the great success stories in peacemaking in recent history, and it had its roots in the special circumstances that developed in the second half of the 1980s. In 1985, there seemed to be no hope for the country. We were going down the drain. The economy was in a terrible position. We were faced with Cuban and Russian-led forces in southern Angola. It didn't look at all good, and there seemed to be no light at the end of the tunnel. But then things started to change. First of all, order was reestablished in South Africa. The revolutionary threat disappeared. Secondly, after the Battle of the Lumber River in October 1987, the Russians decided to pull the plug on their involvement in Southern Africa. So it was a huge development. It meant that Gorbachev told the Cubans and the Angolans that they would have to reach an agreement with South Africa. And this happened in 1988. And these very unlikely parties came together and they agreed on the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola in conjunction with the implementation of the UN's independence plan for Namibia. These were both extremely important developments because it meant the evaporation of South Africa's principal strategic concern. That was the penetration of real Soviet influence in Southern Africa. And secondly, it meant that Namibia could become independent, not as a result of a revolution, but with a proper constitution and with guarantees for all of the different parties and minorities. So those were two really essential elements. Another one, which was incredibly important, was the fact that by 1987, all of the parties involved in the conflict in South Africa had reached the conclusion that there would not be an armed or revolutionary outcome. And I think Nelson Mandela was one of the first people to realize this in his prison cell in 1986. He made it clear he wanted to talk to the government, and he did so without the approval of the ANC in Lusaka. He realized that there was not going to be a revolutionary victory, and that is an absolute requirement if you want to achieve a negotiated settlement for any problem. And then, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union in in November 1989, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, rather, really signaled a massive change in the global strategic situation. And it also weakened the influence of the South African Communist Party within the ANC alliance. And that was always one of the main concerns, because we felt we could deal with an indigenous South African organization, but it would be very difficult to deal with an organization that was effectively under the influence of the Soviet Union. And so those were all factors that created this incredible window of opportunity at the beginning of 1990. And FW De Klerk was able to see this and was able to realize that the circumstances for a negotiated settlement would never again be so favorable. And so he removed all of the obstacles to negotiations in one fell swoop on the 2nd of February in his address to Parliament. And that was the beginning of the process. That was the turning point in South African history.
And then in terms of that CODESA process, where the different parties were trying to influence what the contents of the constitution would be, are there any insights you have as to the nature of that document and whether it was ultimately a success?
The whole process really started with exploratory talks between the ANC and the government at FW Steward, beginning of May 1990, in Pretoria, leading to the Pretoria Minute. And this was really getting ready for negotiations, deciding on the provision of amnesty for everybody to come into the process. And then delayed by serious violence that had developed in South Africa from 1990 primarily onwards. And this was addressed to a certain extent by the establishment of the National Peace Accord, the Goldstone Commission, etc., etc. This opened the way for the beginning of constitutional negotiations at CODESA 1 on the 21st of December 1991, with the adoption of the Declaration of Intent. The Declaration of Intent had been hammered out in talks between the principal parties before the process even began. But it included the blueprint for the constitution that emerged in 1986, the supremacy of the constitution and the rule of law, separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. It included the idea of a justiciable Bill of Rights. It included the idea of provinces and the protection of cultural and language rights. So the Declaration of Intent, after about 5 years, finally blossomed into the 1996 Constitution, which includes all of those elements. And this was, of course, a dramatic change in South Africa's constitutional direction from having been a country in which Parliament was supreme. Now, suddenly, the Constitution was supreme. So it was, in our opinion, the greatest achievement of South Africans and their great diversity in the long and sad and conflicted history of the country.
Are there particular clauses in the Constitution that were very contentious during the negotiation process?
Well, there were many. There were many clauses that were contentious, and many of them were worded ambiguously, so that each party could give its own particular meaning and interpretation to the document that they agreed to support. Some of the most contentious parts of the Constitution dealt with property rights, Section 25, which was phrased in a very ambiguous manner. Unlike the 1993 Constitution, it did not contain a specific right to own property. So that was one of the contentious issues. Another of the contentious issues related to how one would deal with the past. Although the closing paragraphs of the 1993 Constitution were unambiguous, where the clear statement was that amnesty must be given to people who had committed acts with a political motive. That was finally spun into the Truth and Reconciliation Act in 1996, which circumscribed the circumstances under which amnesty would be granted in many, many different ways.
Can you tell us a bit about the formation of the TRC and what the purpose of that commission was?
Well, I think most thinking South Africans accepted the need for some kind of process to deal with the past. Because, as I think George Orwell said, he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. And there's an enormous amount of truth in that. So one of the seminal challenges facing our new society was how we would deal with this very conflicted past. And I think most of the parties accepted the need for a truth and reconciliation process. The National Party did so. And initially, it wanted to cooperate with the TRC and in fact, went out of its way to make positive suggestions. One of FW De Klerk's suggestions was that all of the main participants in the conflict should provide a document to the TRC, which they set out the reasons for their struggle. Why had they done this? Why had they done that? What had they done? And his view was that if each of the main participants in the struggle could do this, it would greatly facilitate the task of the TRC in developing some kind of common understanding of our history. However, this was to be deeply, deeply contested, and de Klerk and many others were absolutely disappointed by the final outcome of the process. The first warning signs came with the composition of the TRC itself. The idea of the TRC was that it should contain or include really a cross-section of parties and individuals who could speak with authority from the perspective of the different conflicted parties. But this wasn't the case. The 17 commissioners included nobody who could speak on behalf of the National Party in the previous dispensation. It included nobody who could speak on behalf of the IFP. And in the struggle, in the conflict that the TRC was supposed to be addressing, these were the main parties. There were three main parties for the conflict. They were the ANC, the National Party government, and the IFP. And two of those parties were absent. And the other thing was that according to the TRC Act, the commissioners were supposed to be people who were impartial and who did not have a high political profile. And regardless of the great affection that we all have for Archbishop Tutu, it cannot be said that he either had a low profile or that he was impartial when it came to considering the conflict of the past. He'd come down very strongly and understandably on one side of the conflict. And the same was true of Alex Moraine, the deputy chair of the TRC. So de Klerk went to Mandela and said, look, President, this is not a balanced commission. And he said, can't we change it so there are at least people who will be able to represent the views of the other parties involved in this conflict? And Mandela was adamant. He said, no. He said, if you open it up, I'm going to put other people in there, but you don't like it. You'll like even less. And that was the first serious warning sign. The other problem that emerged very quickly was the modus operandi of the TRC. It was something that was played out on television, and it dominated the news in South Africa for more than a year. There were terrible stories that came to the fore about the depredations of the security forces and the police and so forth, but very little that came to the fore about the conflict in which the ANC and the IFP had been involved, which had taken most of the lives. And this was also one of the great problems of the TRC, was that its mission was to look at the conflict in South Africa between 1960 and 1994, and then to report on that with a view to promoting national reconciliation. But in fact, the real problem extended much further than that. It was the whole question of colonialism and apartheid and the relationships between black and white South Africans since 1652. That should have been the real topic of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Because if you take the political conflict between 1960 and 1994, it was actually one of the more peaceful processes in recent history. The fact is that in that period, some 22 to 23,000 people died in political violence. And of course, each death is a tragedy. But it pales into insignificance when one considers the cost of lives of other huge transitional processes, the hundreds of thousands of people who died in Algeria, the millions of people who died at the birth of India and Pakistan. It was a tragic process. 22 to 23,000 people died, but this is only 2,000 or 3,000 more people who die in South Africa every year because of ordinary civil murders. The TRC should have looked much more into the great historical context. So all of this played out in the media. There were huge revelations of abominable acts by the security forces. But if you look at the 23,000, 22,000 people who died in this political violence, according to our best calculations, no more than 3,000 or 4,000 were killed by the security forces. Virtually all the rest died in conflict between the ANC on the one hand and the IFP and other black formations on the other, all of which is related in great and convincing detail by Anthea Jeffrey in her book on this struggle. So this was a question of perceptions. It's where the cameras point that makes history. And nearly all of the traumatic stories that emerge from the process, the cameras were pointing at the National Party and the former security forces. They weren't pointing at the ANC, which had assassinated more than 400 IFP leaders in its struggle in Natal. And they didn't say anything about the 52 people who were killed at Shell House in the dying days of the old regime, when the ANC fired on IFP demonstrators outside its office building. It didn't say anything about the 500 or 600 people who'd been necklaced in the most barbaric fashion, or very little. So there was an absolute double standard that permeated the whole process. And this became very evident through the manner in which the TRC dealt with de Klerk himself. It became evident that despite his initial willingness to cooperate with the TRC, despite the fact that he made 2 submissions to the TRC in which he answered all of the queries that they'd asked him, they were out to get him. They wanted to nail de Klerk for some or other gross violation of human rights. And this is admitted by John Allen, one of Archbishop Tutu's closest confidants, in his biography of Tutu, Rebel Rouser. Allen says that there was such an agenda, and he said it was embarrassing how unsubstantiated the charges against de Klerk were. There was a sort of an idea that de Klerk was appearing before the TRC as a supplicant for amnesty of some kind. That wasn't the case. He appeared before the TRC to give the perspective of the National Party and the former government on the conflict of the past. But he was trying to assist the TRC, but he was treated as a criminal by the TRC. There was a specific case, I think in May 1997, when he made his second appearance before the TRC. He'd come along with detailed replies to many questions that the TRC had submitted to him. But it very soon became clear that the TRC wasn't interested in his replies. They slapped a 90-page document in front of him, containing all sorts of allegations. And they expected him to respond to those without having even had a chance to study the document. And as a result of that, despite the fact that he made an impassioned apology for apartheid. During that process, we said he apologized to all of the millions of South Africans who'd suffered indignities in the past, who were deprived of political rights, who were deprived of economic rights, who were arrested for past laws. He apologized for that, but that wasn't enough. Archbishop Tutu the next day burst into tears at the press conference and said, how could he say this? How could he say that he wasn't aware of these terrible depredations or authorized them?
I feel sorry for him, but I mean, maybe he didn't know. But he didn't know. I told him, and people were killed. We went and told them. I mean, to tell me that he didn't know. I'm sad. I'm sad because I had hoped that maybe he didn't know. No, maybe he didn't know.
He himself, Archbishop Tutu, had told de Klerk about the security force involvement in the Boycotton massacre. But then subsequently, the TRC's own Amnesty Committee found that there'd been no police involvement in the Boycotton massacre. And the National Front had to take the TRC to court on a couple of occasions because it just simply wasn't complying with the requirements of its own legislation, the TRC Act. And on both occasions, de Klerk won. And the last one, because it was so close to the date of publication of the report, the page against which he objected had to be blacked out. And of course, that just simply stirred up the hornet's nest and said de Klerk was trying to hide the truth and so forth. But the finding that they made against him, now listen to this, was because Adrian Flock had told him in the dying days of the old regime that he planned to ask for amnesty for his involvement in the Kotze House bombings, in which nobody had been killed. And de Klerk said, well, that's good, if I do that. There was no allegation that de Klerk knew about the Kotze House bombings before or after the event. But because he did not mention that Flock had told him of his intention to apply for amnesty in his original submission to the TRC found him to be guilty after the event in the Kotze House bombings. I mean, it was absurd. It was absolutely absurd. And on that basis, that finding was struck down by the courts. And nevertheless, the truly disturbing thing is that the TRC wanted to nail de Klerk. They wanted to find him guilty of some or other gross violation of human rights. And the reason, I think, is that because they could not accept, in terms of their own Manichaean analysis of history, that anybody from the old regime could possibly emerge without some indelible stain to his character. And that was the tragedy of the whole thing. So the result is that the TRC came out with its own version of South African history. It just simply endorsed the ANC's struggle version of history. And it created the idea of Black people who were honorable and noble and fighting for freedom, and white people who were bad, evil, and wicked. Unless, of course, they belonged to the Communist Party or were fighting for MK, because we're not racists. And that was the problem. And it meant that white South Africans felt that they were welcome in the new South Africa only as payers of reparations for the past and as constant supplicants for forgiveness. And that, I think, is one of the greatest problems underlying our new society. The past continues to dominate the relationship between Black and white South Africans. Every time, almost, there is meeting. It is the elephant in the room.
So if The commission had two goals. The first was to unearth the truth, to find out what atrocities had been committed. How successful was it on that front?
I think it did a good job in many respects in uncovering many of the shocking actions of security forces during this struggle and the activities of people like Prime Eagle, De Klerk, and these others who were guilty of extrajudicial murders, maybe 500 or 600 extrajudicial murders. And that was very important. That was good that this should all come out. It had a cathartic effect, I think.
Senior members of the South African police, implicating also senior SADF officers, have applied for amnesty for a number of murders committed by SAP operatives when they supplied faulty hand grenades to COSAS members in the course of 1985. At least 8 persons were killed and 7 maimed. This operation was authorized and approved by the former Commissioner of Police and the Minister.
Whoever authorized that was guilty of a very gruesome and totally unacceptable decision. It was wrong. It wasn't part of the policy, and whoever authorized it was mala fide and was acting against the interest of South Africa. Can I say, however, that I don't know whether this allegation that a minister ordered it was tested. We are dealing once again here with allegations made by people in amnesty application who are trying to pass the buck. There was never any reference that I can recall in any way whatsoever of our policy being using terrorist methods. Yes, firm action. Yes. Using and applying extraordinary measures. Yes, going underground. Yes, spying. Yes, having covert action. Having a state of emergency. Putting people in camps without trial. All that, yes. But not murdering people, not assassination. It was never part of the policy.
There was nothing like that regarding the necklace murders of over 500 or 600 people. No, their families also needed closure. They also were grieving. There was nothing like that for most of the victims who were IFP members. So again, it I think succeeded in uncovering a lot of the truth. And that was a good thing. A lot of the truth that related overwhelmingly to one side of the conflict and not the other.
Albie Sachs describes this as one of his greatest legal achievements when he was in exile, was creating a constitution for the ANC about what they would do to people that they captured and people that they suspected of being traitors. It came to light that they were torturing people, and he persuaded people that that was wrong. I gather that people were imprisoned without trial, people were tortured in many cruel ways, who were themselves members of the ANC. How much of that information came to light during the TRC process?
I can't recall the degree to which that was discussed by the ANC. And to the degree that it would have been discussed, it would have been rejected by the TRC. And it would have been condemned by the TRC. But it certainly wasn't it didn't have a high profile in the overall visual and media impact of the TRC's work. There was a very dark history, and that has been exposed in a number of authoritative studies. That should have been part of the total picture as well, that it is just another of the facets that didn't quite receive the same attention that the depredations of the elements of the security forces did.
What about Winnie Mandela's testimony? Do you think that what she said or failed to say gave South Africans some greater insight into our history?
Well, Winnie Mandela was a very charismatic person. I met her, and she had a sort of vibrant, magnetic personality. But she had a very checkered past. The fact is that she was charged and found guilty of very serious crimes, including involvement in the death of Stoppy.
In view of the number of young people who have been killed, in view of the number of young people who have been tortured, in retrospect, do you think that you should have handled things differently at the time? Do you have any regret or any remorse for what had happened at the time? Of course, I regret the subsequent losses of life of some of the boys, and I very deeply regretful of what happened. But I do not regret whatsoever for having harbored gun youth and protected them from the vicious system of the day.
And she was rejected as a result of that by many of the more upstanding members of the ANC. But she has since become a cult heroine of the revolution. And all of this is swept under the historic carpet. So she had a very checkered career, very charismatic person, bigger than life. And she was treated with kid gloves by the TRC, although they did condemn and pass negative judgments on some of their actions.
Wasn't there a moment when Desmond Tutu beseeched her to apologize?
I think there was. I don't recall what she did. But my recollection is that she was treated with a great deal of respect and with a great deal of compassion.
Some of the concerns about the TRC are that after people confessed to what they had done, and that some of the things that they had done were horrific, that they were then not punished, that people felt that justice was being sacrificed in the name of truth. Was that sacrifice worthwhile?
You have to look at this in its totality. And the totality goes back to the discussions between the ANC and the government on the whole question of amnesty. And right from the beginning of the negotiations, amnesty was a sine qua non for the continuation of the process. There was no way that the government, which was militarily overwhelmingly powerful, was going to submit to a process that might find many of its leaders subjected to humiliation and punishment by a supposedly victorious revolutionary force. So it was agreed right at the beginning of the process that the Norgard principles would be followed in South Africa in terms of deciding who would qualify for amnesty and who would not qualify for amnesty. The Norgard principles had been applied in Namibia with a certain degree of success. They stipulated that any act with a bona fide political vote qualified for amnesty, provided that egregious violence had not been used and that personal advancement or personal interests were not involved. And this was the understanding until the 26th of September, 1992, with the adoption of the Record of Understanding. Because one of the 6 demands that the ANC finally made for returning to the negotiations was the release of all its remaining cadres from prison, irrespective of the crimes that they had committed. And for de Klerk, this was an extremely unpalatable question. He didn't have problems with the other demands, but he was prepared to break on this question that his own security force colleagues said, no, that he should go ahead and accept it, because they, of course, were interested in unconditional amnesty themselves. And so the Further Indemnity Act was adopted in, I think, December 1992, in terms of which people could be granted indemnity simply because the crime they had been committed with a political motive. And the legislation was adopted in order to make this possible. It caused a furore at the time because everybody thought this was the National Party government trying to find a way to excuse and exculpate its own followers. But in fact, the Further Indemnity Act was used overwhelmingly by the ANC. And in terms of the act, I think some 1,400 ANC cadres were released from prison, some who had committed egregious crimes, including necklace murders and other horrific actions. McBride, who had been involved in the terrorist bombing of a fast food outlet in Durban was released in terms of the further indemnity bill, and also the truly despicable Barnett Stradall, who killed 8 people, Black South Africans, in cold blood in Pretoria a year or 2 earlier. And he'd been sentenced to death, but in terms of the Further Indemnity Act, there was no way that the state could prevent him slipping through the net as a result. That was the situation with regard to amnesty. One of the National Party's great failings during the negotiations, which was pinned sometimes on Kobie Coetzee and sometimes on Rolf Meyer, was the failure to nail down a clear agreement on amnesty and a clear agreement on how South Africa would deal with the past in the new dispensation. The post-amble to the 1993 Constitution says very, very clearly and explicitly that amnesty shall be granted to people who committed acts with a political motive. It was unambiguous, but that was then taken and spat into the Truth and Reconciliation Act, and it soon emerged that not only did you have to have had a political motive, you must then give a full and frank account of all of the ancillary factors. And it was up to the Amnesty Committee to decide whether you'd done so or not. And it was on this basis that the assassins of Chris Hani were refused amnesty.
8,000 people had applied for amnesty, but just over 10% of people actually were granted amnesty. But barring a small number of prosecutions, and you mentioned the killers of Chris Hani and Eugene de Kock, very few people who were not granted amnesty were prosecuted.
There was an attempt to prosecute the leadership of the South African Defence Force and top operatives from the pre-1994 dispensation. And Magnus Balan, I think General Jannie Geldenhuys, several other generals were all charged with serious crimes, but they were acquitted. Nevertheless, it showed a determination on the part of the ANC at that time to proceed with prosecutions against their former enemies. And it looked very much as though this was there was a political agenda. One must remember that the leadership of the ANC was also not granted amnesty because they made a collective application for amnesty, and amnesty had to be applied for in the name of individuals. So none of the ANC leadership had been given amnesty either, and they had presided over actions that had involved gross violations of human rights. So if in a society, in a new dispensation, where everybody is equal before the law and where there is no discrimination on the basis of race, there would then be no reason to act in a matter that was not even-handed with regard to people who perpetrated gross violations of human rights from the ANC side.
So was there a situation where you had a practical détente, where both sides knew that if you start to prosecute the other side, that will open up the possibility of prosecutions on the other, and to then sort of say, well, we need to move on to the second aim of this project, which is reconciliation. We won't engage in, mountains and mountains of criminal processes.
Yeah, well, it seems as though that was the case, because reference was made to such an agreement by Rodriguez, who was charged with crimes, with murder of Timo in, I think, 2016-17. And he said, look, there'd been an agreement. I'm not aware of it. FW De Klerk wasn't aware of it. But it seemed as after the trial of Angus Malan and his colleagues, there was a decision to drop such prosecutions. Who was behind it? What the agreements were, we don't know. But that appears to be the case. But the whole thing was revived again with the decision to prosecute Rodriguez. And recently, the NPA made an announcement that it was now pursuing some 55 or so different cases from the pre-1994 era and that it had established a special division for this with 30 prosecutors. One would have imagined that the FBA has more than enough work to do arising from state capture at this time, rather than to go and delve into things that happened 40, 50, 60 years ago. But evidently, there is that intention. And once again, if the NPA decides to proceed along those lines, then it is bound by the Constitution to be even-handed in the manner in which it goes about prosecuting people from the past. Otherwise, it's revenge. That's not very good for reconciliation.
You referenced George Orwell earlier, in the sense that if you can control the past, you can control the future. So is there a sense in which, if your present is going very badly, because it's come out that as the party of so-called liberation, you have stolen from the people, you have been corrupt, you have committed a number of atrocities, and you've been involved in your own massacre, namely Marikana, and it would be very useful to talk about the bad guys from the past and have some public show trials to demonstrate that, in comparison, you are still the wonderful liberators.
The past is one of the best things that the ANC has going for it. And it never ceases to hammer on the past. So you'll see that any major ANC event or major ANC speech, a great deal of time will be spent dealing with the past, how bad the enemies were, how good the struggle side was, how noble this comrade was, etc., etc. And of course, that resonates with many, many South Africans who suffered immense humiliation in the past and whose interests were really ignored for many, many decades under minority rule. It is one of the main driving forces in the national democratic revolution. But it is the same in the politics of divided societies all over the world. So you still have the Orange men in Northern Ireland celebrating the Battle of the Boyne every year that took place in 1690 or something. And people like to revert to the past, to stir up all of the emotions and to strengthen group feelings. And this can be a wonderful way of mobilizing support for parties that are in trouble. Wherever you beat the tribal drum, people are going to forget for the moment about the problems of the present and the hopes of the future.
One of the people that I've interviewed in this series, Salim Nakjavani, was a prosecutor in Cambodia, prosecuting the Khmer Rouge. One of the things that you had in Cambodia was this mass genocide of Khmer people. So almost a third of people were brutally murdered. It's something like 2.2 million people. Can you put into perspective the crimes that were committed during apartheid and whether the term crime against humanity is a term that ought to have been used to describe apartheid?
Yeah, if one considers the absolute denial of fundamental rights to people on the basis of their race, after 1910, before 1910, the deprivation of land and property, the humiliation of people who are told that they don't have freedom of movement, etc., etc., then those would certainly qualify as a crime against humanity in terms of the Statute of Rome. But then again, it's not a monolithic situation. At the time that many of these depredations were happening, there was an equal denial of fundamental human rights to the vast majority of humanity, and particularly to the vast majority of humanity in Africa and developing countries. And so up until 1950, 1960, South Africa was doing really bad things to people on the basis of race that other people were doing in the rest of Africa and that the Americans were doing in the southern states. And one of the great turning points in modern history took place in 1948. This was when there was an absolute divergence between South Africa and the rest of the world, because this was the year in which the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was the year in which the National Party was elected to power in South Africa and set off in precisely the opposite direction from the direction that the world was now moving in, with the Declaration of Human Rights, which resoundingly called for the end of any racial discrimination, which resoundingly proclaimed the equality of all human beings without any reference to sex or gender or race or whatever. So South Africa was going in one direction and the world was going in another direction. And the situation was also not monolithic. Now, if anybody talks about apartheid, there is an immediate cessation of radical thought. It is the most emotionally laden term in politics, probably. It forecloses any further discussion. Apartheid, that's it. But in fact, there were 4 clear phases of apartheid before 1994. There was the period between 1948 and 1958 under the London Stratum, which was straightforward racial domination. And it was paternalistic at best and brutally exploited at worst. And then things were starting to change. One of the fulcrums was the collapse of French and British will after the Suez Crisis. And Ghana became independent the next year in 1957. This wasn't foreseen at the beginning of the 50s. And again, South Africa was going in one direction and the rest of the world was going in the other. And then a sociologist became Prime Minister of South Africa, Hendrik French Verwoerd. And one of the great lessons of history is don't put sociologists in charge of countries because they will do social engineering. And that's exactly what Verwoerd did. He thought, oh, well, the rest of the world going about a decolonization process. Well, we'll do exactly the same in South Africa. We'll give the Zulus Zululand and blah, 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 blah. And the problem was that in this dispensation, Black South Africans ended up with 13.7% of the land. Nothing was done with regard to the position of the grey, black majority of the so-called white areas. And no provision was made for coloured and Indian South Africans in the rest of South Africa. And there was a great deal of enthusiasm about this. Capitals were created, universities were built, all of this sort of stuff. And it led a whole generation of Afrikaans leaders, Afrikaner leaders, down the garden path for 20 years, imagining that they had a solution to the problems of the country. But of course they didn't. It just deepened many of the injustices of apartheid. Racial segregation and humiliation continued as a reality in most of South Africa. And there was just straightforward exploitation. You had the removal of people from District 6 because they didn't fit into the plan or the model that the apartheid sociologists had devised. So that was the second period. But it did accept that blacks and whites had political rights and had a right to advance to any level in society. So the third era of apartheid was from 1978 till the end of 1988. And that was reform under PW Botha. And Botha realized that separate development wasn't working. There was this idea that by 1978, the flow of people from the rural areas to the urban areas would be reversed. But of course, it was nonsense. And PW Botha realized that. So he realized that although the homelands might be part of a solution and that it was great for them to continue to develop, etc., 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 there was still no solution for coloureds and Indians, and there was still no solution for black South Africans living in so-called white South Africa. And so he launched a very genuine reform process. And this actually started under John Forster in his dying days of his premiership with the Vion Commission report. And this introduced in the early 80s genuine trade union rights for black South Africans. And that, of course, greatly enhanced their real political power. And this was followed by the dismantling of some 100 apartheid laws and measures during the first part of the 1980s, and including the abolition of the hated pass laws and including recognition of property rights for Black South Africans in the so-called white areas, and the extension of real municipal powers to Black municipalities in white South Africa. So there was a lot of genuine reform, and one of the major measures was bringing the coloureds and the Indians into the same polity as whites, whether they wanted it or not. And this was done on a consociational basis. The model that was chosen was the kind of model that they had in Belgium, where you have a parliament for the Walloons, a parliament for the Flemish, and then a national parliament which deals with the common affairs. And the idea was like, okay, well, look, colored South Africans will have their own parliament, and they'll be in charge of all of their affairs, whether they like it or not. The Indians will be the same. They'll have their own schools, their schools, social services, all of the stuff that affects their communities, again, whether they like it or not. And then common affairs will be dealt with in an overarching parliament, in a national parliament, where whites will still conveniently have an overall majority. So that was the plan. Although it was vilified, it was a step in the direction of genuine reforms. And of course, all of this unleashed enormous expectations. We suspect that P.W. Botha was not a reader or a follower of had access to Tocqueville. Otherwise, he would have realized that revolutions do not take place in periods of repression. They take place exactly when societies begin to reform. It is then that the expectations take off, and the expectations took off. And we had widespread violence throughout the country. We had 2 states, national states of emergency. In 1985, it looked as though, well, to the ANC and to the Communist Party, as though South Africa was against the ropes. I think Joe Slovo and his friends had images of the red flag flying over the Union buildings and all of this, but it didn't happen. Just didn't happen because the balance of forces was and still overwhelmingly in favor of the National Party government. But it did mean that P.W. Botha had to slam the anchors on as far as reform was concerned. And this was the situation that obtained in the country in the very, very dark days of the middle 1980s. And the nadir probably came with P.W. Botha's Rubicon speech, which is our candidate for the worst political communication in history. Not just South Africa, we proudly present it as just about the worst political communication you can imagine. Creating wild expectations throughout the world. Margaret Thatcher watching it, and Ronald Reagan watching it, and everybody expecting some great breakthrough, which there actually was in the speech, but it was so badly written and so badly delivered that nobody noticed it. So that was the depth of the situation. And people who are worried about South Africa now forget about that time, because there did not appear to be any hope. We were absolutely isolated. The ground was falling through the basement. We were really struggling to reach an agreement with the international bankers to save our situation. And they just seemed to be thinking about how we're going to get out of this hole. But then things changed. Order was restored by 1987. ANC began to accept it wouldn't be a revolutionary outcome. We had the huge developments in Angola and Southwest Africa. We had the collapse of the Berlin Wall and Soviet communism. And all of that opened the way to new leadership. One of the pivotal points was also the stroke that P.W. Botha had in January 1989, which led him to resign the leadership of the National Party. Crazy, without notifying anybody, just sending a letter to the caucus in Cape Town. And that meant that a new leader could be selected. And that was FW De Klerk, and that was the right man at the right time, because he understood the need to get out of the hole that had been dug for South Africa over so many decades and centuries. And so those were all key factors in the unfolding process.
And so can you tell us about that final stage of apartheid, I suppose the end stage of apartheid?
That's the fourth stage of apartheid, and that is not apartheid any longer at all, because it was transformation. That really was from 1989, when de Klerk took over as president, till 1994. And the purpose of his presidency was to dismantle apartheid, to abolish the remaining elements of apartheid. Much had already gone under the leadership of P.W. Botha, and then to open the way to the adoption of a new constitution that would end forever, we hoped, a society built on race and racial discrimination and racial domination. So that was the goal. And that period, in my opinion, cannot be called apartheid at all, because its purpose was the abolition of apartheid. And it doesn't fall in the definition of the crime of apartheid in the statute of definition. So that was de Klerk's purpose. And it is bitterly ironic that he's so often referred to as the last apartheid president. It's like referring to Abraham Lincoln as the last slavery president. The whole purpose of his presidency was to abolish apartheid.
So you mentioned that there was this dream of a non-racial society. This is a value that's encoded into the Freedom Charter. It's in Section 1 of our Constitution, this notion of equality before the law, that people will be judged by the content of their character as opposed to the color of their skin. Have we achieved that in modern South Africa?
Well, we certainly haven't, and unfortunately we're going in the opposite direction. So South Africa is now probably the most racialized polity in the world, where one's race determines to a greater extent the life opportunities of people than in any other country. Not only the legislation is racialized, but also the discourse. The propagation of negative racial stereotypes has been part of the political process now for many years. Hardly a major speech is made by the ANC without a reference to the past, the unresolved past, without some sort of statement to the effect that some people are the bearers of original sin because their ancestors came to South Africa as long ago as 1652. But to say that you're the bearer of original sin is shocking. It's indelible, it's hereditary. And it means that those South Africans born into this situation are morally inferior. And that screams against everything that we were trying to achieve and everything that is expressed in Section 1 of our Constitution. In those circumstances, there can't be any question of human dignity. Once you kick out the cornerstone of non-racialism, the rest of the edifice collapses, because there cannot be human dignity if there is not non-racialism. There cannot be the achievement of equality if everybody is not equal before the law. And many fundamental rights, human rights and freedoms, are then affected by race rather than the content of character and the individual qualities of South African citizens.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Constitutional Landmarks. Throughout this series, I'm going to be interviewing some of the greatest advocates that have ever appeared in the Constitutional Court. I will also be speaking to the judges who authored the court's landmark decisions. We'll be speaking about gay marriage, free speech, and a range of other exciting issues.